The thunder of engines filled the morning sky over the Pacific. September 1st, 1943, stretched clear and endless above the blue waters. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loach gripped his controls tight. His brand-new Grumman F-6F Hellcat cut through the air like a blade. The horizon stretched toward enemy territory below. What unfolded in the next few minutes would shatter Japanese aerial dominance forever. The clock showed 10:27 when Loach's eyes locked onto something massive. A four-engine flying boat carved across the distant sky. The Kawanishi H-8K looked enormous against the morning light. Allied pilots called these giants Emily. The Japanese aircrew inside probably felt confident. Another American fighter approached. They had handled plenty before. This one would be no different. How wrong they were. 650 caliber machine guns erupted in deadly harmony. Loach's Hellcat delivered devastating punishment. The Emily twisted downward, trailing fire and smoke. The Pacific swallowed it whole. History had just been written. The F-6F claimed its first aerial victory. Japanese pilots across the theater had no warning of the storm approaching their skies. For nearly 24 months, the Mitsubishi A6M-0 had reigned supreme. The lightweight fighter moved like a deadly dancer through Pacific skies. Its incredible range allowed strikes deep into enemy territory. Agility that seemed supernatural had carved through American formations with surgical precision. Japanese naval aviators felt invincible for good reason. Their mounts could outturn, outclimb, and outrange almost every American fighter in service. The nimble Zero weighed barely 4,000 pounds empty. American fighters seemed clumsy and heavy by comparison. Every ounce of the Zero's design focused on maneuverability and endurance. The Nakajima Sakai engine produced only 1,000 horsepower, but engineers had crafted every component for maximum performance. The result was aerial poetry in motion. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated Zero superiority with shocking effectiveness. Wake Island fell to Zero squadrons that seemed unstoppable. The Philippines witnessed American fighters torn apart by Japanese precision. Zero pilots had proven their deadly skill across the Pacific. American pilots faced these encounters with growing dread. The F-4F Wildcat represented the best American response available. Stubby and barrel-shaped, the Wildcat earned respect, but not fear from Japanese aviators. While tough enough to absorb punishment, it was slower and less maneuverable than the Zero. Survival became the best American pilots could hope for. Defensive tactics like the Thatch Weave helped some pilots live through encounters. But living through combat was different from winning it. Behind the scenes, however, American planners were learning crucial lessons. Intelligence reports painted a clear picture by early 1942. The Zero's remarkable performance came at a terrible price. Japanese designers had sacrificed pilot protection for agility. Armor plating was non-existent. Self-sealing fuel tanks were absent. Structural reinforcement remained minimal. A well-placed burst could transform the graceful fighter into a burning tomb. This weakness would prove fatal to Japanese hopes. American engineers began incorporating these revelations into their designs. April 22, 1942, brought a crucial moment. Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare toured the Grumman factory on Long Island. O'Hare already carried fame from his single-handed defense of the carrier Lexington. He had faced Zeros in mortal combat and survived. President Roosevelt asked O'Hare a simple question. What did American naval aviation need in a new fighter? O'Hare's answer was equally simple, something that would go upstairs faster. Grumman engineers were already pursuing that goal. Leroy Grumman himself led the design team. Chief designers Jake Swerble and Bill Schwendler worked alongside him. Their creation would exploit every zero-weakness intelligence had revealed. They called their project the XF-6F. History would know it as the Hellcat. From conception, this fighter was designed as an anti-Zero weapon. Where Japanese designers chose finesse, Americans would rely on brute force. Where the Zero sacrificed protection, the Hellcat would become a flying fortress. The philosophy was brutally simple. Build an aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment. Pack it with overwhelming firepower. Make it outperform the enemy when performance mattered most. The engine would be this fighter's heart. Initially, Grumman planned to use the Wright R-2600 Cyclone. The same power plant drove many American bombers. But Navy officials and engineers began eyeing something much more powerful. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp represented American engineering at its finest. 18 cylinders arranged in a massive radial configuration. 2,000 horsepower available on demand. Double the power of any Zero engine. Getting the R-2800 required creative procurement methods. The engine was already earmarked for Republic's P-47 Thunderbolt. Chance Vaught's F-4U Corsair also needed these power plants. Both programs were running behind schedule. Navy officials, Apollos Vasseler and George Anderson, essentially borrowed one precious engine. They delivered it directly to Grumman for testing. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Test pilots described the improvement as phenomenal. The difference between day and night became obvious instantly. While the Hellcat took shape in American factories, Japanese pilots continued their Pacific victories. They had no warning that American engineers were systematically addressing every Zero advantage. The new fighter would be faster in diving attacks, more heavily armed than anything previously fielded, capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy a Zero instantly. June 26, 1942, marked the first XF-6F1 flight. Just over a month later, July 30th brought the more powerful XF-6F3 into the sky. The massive Double Wasp engine roared above Long Island with authority. By October, the first production F-6F3 was combat-ready. Conception to combat readiness had taken less than 18 months. This remarkable achievement would reshape the entire Pacific War. But performance statistics only revealed part of the story. The Hellcat incorporated lessons from every Pacific aerial encounter. The cockpit sat higher in the fuselage for superior visibility. Engine cowling sloped downward to give pilots unobstructed forward views. 212 pounds of armor plating protected pilot and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant bullets wouldn't necessarily cause fatal fires. The armament was devastating by any measure. 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns. Each weapon carried 400 rounds of ammunition. The Hellcat delivered more concentrated firepower than most bombers. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they could deliver over 3,000 rounds per minute. Armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition could literally tear enemy aircraft apart. A single well-aimed burst would be sufficient to destroy any opponent. American factories worked around the clock producing the new fighter. Meanwhile, Japanese naval aviation faced a growing crisis few understood. Early victories had cost Japan its most experienced pilots. Men who had spent years perfecting their skills over China were being systematically eliminated. The Japanese training philosophy kept the best pilots in combat until death claimed them. Unlike American systems that rotated veterans back to training commands, Japan consumed its expertise in endless battles. Every aerial engagement reduced the pool of veteran aviators. American pilot training programs continued expanding and improving. By 1943, many Zero squadrons were filled with hastily trained replacements. These young pilots inherited the same aircraft their predecessors had flown, but they lacked the hard-won experience that had made Japanese aerial supremacy possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine Pacific aviation's future. American factories completed dozens of Hellcats every week. On carrier decks across the Pacific, American pilots trained in cutting-edge aircraft. In Japanese airfields from Rabaul to the home islands, Zero pilots prepared for battle. They remained unaware that Americans had developed a weapon specifically designed to destroy them. Fighting Squadron 33 arrived on Guadalcanal in late August 1943. 24 F-6F Hellcats accompanied the squadron. Pilots were eager to test their new mounts against legendary Zero fighters. The legendary aircraft had dominated this region for months. VF-33 pilots would not wait long for their chance. Lieutenant Loach's victory over the Emily flying boat was just the beginning. The real test would come when fighters met in aerial combat. Japanese pilots would quickly discover their initial dismissal was premature. The aircraft they considered just another American fighter was actually a precisely engineered Zero killing machine. Naval aviation's transformation was about to begin. It would be swift, decisive, and utterly devastating to Japanese hopes. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The Grumman Hellcat would be the instrument of that dramatic reversal. What followed would be remembered as one of military history's most lopsided aerial campaigns. But in September 1943, as first Hellcats prepared for combat, both sides could only guess at the magnitude of approaching devastation. The first true aerial duel happened almost by accident. November 23, 1943, brought American and Japanese fighters together over Tarawa's coral atolls. What emerged was a preview of coming devastation. When smoke cleared, 30 Zeros had been claimed destroyed. American losses totaled just one F-6F. Japanese pilots who survived reported something that shook their commanders' confidence. The new American fighters weren't just surviving dogfights, they were winning them decisively. This was unprecedented in Pacific combat. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton McWhorter became the first American to achieve ace status in a Hellcat. Flying from the carrier Essex, he shot down his fifth enemy aircraft over Kwajalein. McWhorter would eventually be credited with 12 aerial victories. His precision earned him the nickname One-Shot Mac. He once destroyed a twin-engine Betty bomber using just 86 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. This feat demonstrated both his skill and the Hellcat's devastating firepower concentration. Rabaul provided the first real shock for Japanese pilots. November 11, 1943, brought day-long battles involving dozens of aircraft. Hellcats and Corsairs engaged wave after wave of Japanese fighters. The most intense aerial combat of the Pacific War unfolded over New Britain. American pilots claimed nearly 50 enemy aircraft destroyed. More importantly, they demonstrated tactics that would become standard throughout the war. The key was avoiding the Zero's greatest strength. Its ability to outturn virtually any opponent at low speeds remained formidable. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, Hellcat pilots employed boom and zoom tactics. They would dive from altitude at high speed, make a devastating firing pass at maximum velocity, then climb away before Japanese pilots could respond effectively. The Zero's light construction became a fatal weakness when confronted with superior diving speed. American test pilots who flew captured Zeros confirmed combat reports. The Hellcat was faster at all altitudes above 14,000 feet. It could outdive the Japanese fighter at any altitude. While the Zero retained climb rate advantages below 14,000 feet, these became meaningless when American pilots refused to fight on Japanese terms. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was immediate and devastating. Pilots accustomed to American fighters fleeing from encounters suddenly faced opponents that actively sought combat. The Hellcat's robust construction allowed pilots to press attacks even while taking hits. Earlier American fighters would have been forced to break off under similar circumstances. Navy pilot reports from late 1943 painted pictures of Japanese confusion and growing desperation. One combat report noted the Hellcat climbed with a Zeke once. Generally, the F-6F cannot climb with a Zeke. The Zeke will sometimes dive with a Hellcat, although the F-6F has proved it usually can outdive the Zeke. Another report observed that Hellcats succeeded in turning inside the Zeke on several occasions. On others, Hellcats were unable to accomplish this. The Zeke could probably always turn in on the F-6F, but he doesn't like to face those 650 caliber machine guns. That last observation proved prophetic. As word spread through Japanese naval aviation about devastating American firepower, Zero pilots showed increasing reluctance to press home attacks. The psychological advantage that had sustained Japanese aerial supremacy was rapidly shifting to the Americans. The transformation became apparent in kill ratios. Early Hellcat operations in September 1943 showed roughly equal exchanges with Japanese fighters. By December, Americans were claiming 5 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost. Even accounting for inevitable overclaiming in aerial combat, the trend was unmistakable. Japanese naval aviation was being systematically destroyed. The ultimate test came in June 1944 during what became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American forces had launched Operation Forager. The invasion of the Mariana Islands brought B-29 bombers within range of Japanese home islands for the first time. For the Imperial Navy, this represented the moment for the decisive battle they had planned since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled the most powerful carrier force Japan could muster. 9 aircraft carriers embarked over 400 aircraft. Battleships and cruisers provided support. Facing them was Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58. 15 carriers launched 900 aircraft. Hundreds of the newest F-6F-5 Hellcats included water injection systems that boosted performance even further. The battle began at dawn on June 19, 1944. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had located the American fleet west of Saipan. Ozawa launched 4 massive airstrikes involving over 300 aircraft. What happened next earned the name Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name perfectly captured the one-sided nature of aerial combat that followed. The first Japanese strike wave of 69 aircraft was intercepted by over 200 Hellcats. The interception occurred 55 miles from American carriers. Slaughter was immediate and comprehensive. American pilots, guided by fighter director officers, could track incoming raids on radar. They positioned themselves perfectly for devastating attacks. Lieutenant Charles Sims, a Japanese-speaking intelligence officer aboard Lexington, listened to enemy radio communications. He passed real-time intelligence to American fighter directors. This gave Hellcat pilots an almost unfair advantage. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft was torn apart before reaching the American fleet. Of the first attack group, only 25 aircraft survived long enough to sight American carriers. Most of these survivors were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. The second wave of 53 aircraft fared even worse. 43 were destroyed. The survivors achieved no hits on American ships. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu flew from Lexington that day. He shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. This feat was photographed as he held up 6 fingers on the carrier's flight deck afterward. His success was remarkable, but not unique. Hellcat pilots throughout Task Force 58 achieved multiple kills as Japanese formations disintegrated under their attacks. The third Japanese strike wave of 47 aircraft met the same fate as its predecessors. American pilots described the combat as like an old-time turkey shoot. Japanese aircraft seemed unable to adapt to Hellcat's superior performance. The tactical innovations American pilots had developed proved devastatingly effective. Most devastating of all, Zero pilots appeared poorly trained. They lacked the experience and skill that had made their predecessors so formidable. By the end of June 19th, Japanese naval aviation had suffered catastrophic defeat. Over 300 carrier aircraft had been destroyed. Another 50 land-based aircraft on Guam were also eliminated. American losses totaled just 29 aircraft. Most fell to anti-aircraft fire rather than Japanese fighters. The kill ratio reached an almost unbelievable 19-1 in American favor. The human cost to Japanese naval aviation exceeded even aircraft losses. Hundreds of experienced pilots were killed or went missing. They represented years of training and combat experience that could never be replaced. The Japanese naval aviation training system was already strained by 2 years of intensive combat. It could not produce replacements quickly enough. Skill levels of new pilots remained inadequate for modern combat. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet limped home with carrier decks nearly empty. The proud naval aviation force that launched the Pearl Harbor attack had been effectively destroyed in a single day. Future Japanese operations would rely increasingly on land-based aircraft. Eventually, desperate measures like kamikaze attacks would become necessary. The Hellcat's success in the Marianas Battle established American air superiority over the Pacific for the war's remainder. Task Force 58 fighters demonstrated they could not only defend the fleet, but actively seek out and destroy enemy aviation wherever found. The big blue blanket of American fighters would soon extend over Japanese-held territory throughout the Pacific. For American pilots who flew the Hellcat, the aircraft represented everything they had hoped for in a fighter. It was fast enough to catch any Japanese aircraft, tough enough to absorb tremendous battle damage, armed with enough firepower to destroy any opponent with a single burst. Lieutenant Will Carroll flew Hellcats throughout the war. He remembered the aircraft as robust and powerful. He noted that you had to learn it for yourself. The Hellcat's forgiving flight characteristics made it ideal for demanding carrier operations. Unlike some high-performance fighters that were difficult to handle, the F-6F was stable and predictable. This allowed pilots to focus on combat rather than fighting their own aircraft. Reliability proved crucial during massive night recovery operations following the Philippine Sea Battle. Hundreds of aircraft had to land on carrier decks in darkness. The Hellcat's predictable handling characteristics made these dangerous operations possible. By war's end, Hellcats had accounted for over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. No other Allied fighter achieved comparable success. 307 Navy pilots became aces flying the F-6F. David McCampbell shot down 34 enemy aircraft to become the Navy's leading ace. On October 24, 1944, McCampbell achieved the remarkable feat of shooting down 9 enemy aircraft in a single mission. His performance that day remains unmatched in naval aviation history. The impact extended far beyond immediate tactical victories. Japanese naval aviation's destruction opened the way for American forces to advance directly toward the home islands. The Mariana Islands became bases for B-29 superfortresses. These bombers would systematically destroy Japan's major cities. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. The supposed invincibility of their naval aviation had been shattered by an opponent they initially underestimated. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats carried grim reports back to their commanders. The new American fighters were not just superior in performance. They were flown by pilots who seemed to possess unlimited confidence and aggressive tactical doctrine. The defensive mentality that began characterizing Japanese operations became increasingly pronounced. Word spread about the devastating effectiveness of American fighter tactics. This further eroded Japanese pilot morale and combat effectiveness. The industrial capacity that produced the Hellcat demonstrated American superiority beyond mere combat performance. Grumman manufactured over 12,000 F-6Fs between June 1942 and November 1945. This represented the largest number of fighters ever produced at a single factory. This production achievement meant American carrier squadrons never lacked replacement aircraft. Japanese forces struggled with chronic shortages of both aircraft and spare parts. The contrast in industrial capacity became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The Hellcat success story was ultimately about more than superior engineering or manufacturing capability. It represented a systematic approach to warfare that analyzed enemy strengths and weaknesses. Specific solutions were then developed to exploit those weaknesses. The F-6F was not just a better fighter than the Zero. It was a fighter specifically designed to destroy Zeros and everything Japanese air doctrine represented. This focused approach to weapons development proved devastatingly effective. As the war continued into 1945, the Hellcat evolved into new roles beyond air-to-air combat. Fighter-bomber variants carried bombs and rockets against ground targets. Night fighter versions hunted Japanese aircraft in darkness. The basic design proved so adaptable that F-6Fs continued serving in various capacities well into the 1950s. The final irony of the Hellcat story lies in how completely it achieved its original purpose. Designed as a Zero killer, the F-6F was so successful that by late 1944, few Zeros remained to kill. Japanese naval aviation had been so thoroughly destroyed that most Hellcat pilots in the war's final months flew ground attack missions. There were simply no enemy fighters left to engage. When Japanese officials signed surrender documents aboard the battleship Missouri in September 1945, American aircraft filled the skies above Tokyo Bay. Many were Hellcats. The fighter that had been dismissed by some Japanese pilots as just another American design had become the instrument of their Air Force's destruction. The hunters had indeed become the hunted. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat delivered the decisive blow that ended Japanese dreams of air superiority over the Pacific. The Hellcat's lesson remains relevant today. Technological superiority, combined with superior training and tactics, can overcome even the most experienced and determined opponent. In the vast expanse of the Pacific theater, the F-6F proved that American industrial might and engineering innovation could create decisive weapons of war. The thunder that broke over the Pacific in 1943 continued rolling until it reached Japan's shores. It carried with it the unmistakable sound of American victory echoing across the waves.